The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, a struggle for independence. The year was 1775, and tensions between the 13 American colonies and Great Britain had reached a boiling point. What had once been a cooperative relationship under British rule had evolved into a conflict that would soon ignite into full-scale war. Taxes, laws, and the desire for autonomy clashed with the British Crown's desire to maintain control over its profitable colonies. No one could have foreseen that this conflict, which began with small protests, would ultimately give birth to a new nation, the United States of America. The seeds of rebellion. The trouble started years before the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. After the costly 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, the British government found itself deep in debt. Seeking to raise revenue from its colonies, it imposed a series of taxes on the American settlers, who had enjoyed a relatively high degree of freedom until then. The Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed all paper documents, and the Townshend Acts of 1767, which taxed goods such as tea and glass, were deeply unpopular in the colonies. The rallying cry of the colonists became, "No taxation without representation." They believed it was unfair to be taxed by a government in which they had no elected representatives. The colonies had their own assemblies and had grown used to governing themselves in many ways. The new taxes felt like a betrayal, and resentment toward the British government spread like wildfire. Resistance began with protests, boycotts, and petitions. The Boston Massacre of 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd of colonists, killing 5, only fanned the flames of unrest. Tensions reached a tipping point in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dressed as Native Americans boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of the Tea Act. The British response was swift and harsh. The Intolerable Acts of 1774 punished Massachusetts by closing Boston Harbor and stripping the colony of its self-governance. But rather than subdue the colonies, the British actions only united them against a common enemy. The war begins. In April 1775, the simmering tension finally boiled over. British soldiers, under orders to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts, marched out from Boston. Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith and fervent patriot, rode through the night to warn the colonial militias. "The British are coming!" At dawn on April 19, 1775, British troops encountered a group of colonial militiamen, known as Minutemen, on the village green in Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. The skirmish at Lexington left 8 colonists dead and was followed by a larger battle in Concord, where the colonists successfully drove the British troops back to Boston. The American Revolution had officially begun. In response, thousands of colonial volunteers joined militias, while the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to discuss the next steps. They appointed a tall, stern Virginian named George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was tasked with turning a loose collection of farmers and tradesmen into a fighting force capable of standing against the world's most powerful army. The struggle for independence. The war that followed was not an easy one for the American colonies. The British had a professional army and the world's most powerful navy, while the colonists were poorly trained and lacked supplies. In the early years of the war, the British appeared to have the upper hand. They won several significant victories, including the capture of New York City in 1776. But the Americans had a secret weapon, their resilience and belief in their cause. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress made a bold move that changed the course of the conflict. They formally declared their independence from Britain by adopting Thomas Jefferson's eloquent and radical Declaration of Independence, which famously stated that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With this document, the colonies officially broke away from Britain and entered the war not just as rebels, but as a fledgling nation fighting for its existence. Washington's army suffered through bitter defeats and near collapse, but the American cause was kept alive by a few key moments. One of these came in December 776, when Washington led a daring attack across the Delaware River, surprising the British and their Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. This bold victory gave the Continental Army and the Patriot cause a much-needed morale boost at a time when defeat seemed inevitable. Foreign support and a turning point. The tide of the war began to turn in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga, where American forces under General Horatio Gates achieved a stunning victory over the British in upstate New York. This battle proved to the world that the Americans could win and convinced France to openly join the war as an American ally. French support in the form of money, troops, and especially their powerful navy would be crucial to the eventual American victory. Benjamin Franklin, already a beloved figure in France, had been working tirelessly to secure French support. With the victory at Saratoga, France saw the potential for an American triumph and officially entered the war in 1778. Soon after, Spain and the Dutch Republic also lent their support to the American cause, creating a global conflict that stretched Britain's resources thin. The final victory. The war dragged on for several more years, with Washington's army enduring brutal winters and more hard-fought battles. One of the most trying moments came during the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where Washington's troops suffered from cold, hunger, and disease. But the army emerged stronger, thanks in part to training from a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, who drilled the troops into a more disciplined fighting force. The final major battle of the war took place in Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis had fortified his troops in the coastal town, expecting reinforcements from the British Navy, but a French fleet arrived first, cutting off any escape by sea. Washington, along with French General Charles Rochambeau, surrounded Cornwallis on land. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his army of over 7,000 men. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war. The Treaty of Paris and independence after Yorktown, fighting continued sporadically, but the British will to continue the war was broken. In 1783, the conflict officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The war that had begun with protests and skirmishes had ended with the birth of a new nation. The American Revolution was not just a war for territory or power. It was a war for ideas. The principles of liberty, self-governance, and the rights of the individual were radical in the 18th century, but they became the foundation of the United States of America. Through years of hardship, struggle, and sacrifice, the American colonies had won their independence and changed the course of history.